Please be seated. All right, we're going to be in Ecclesiastes, and my voice is certainly not 100% again, but it is, I at least have it. As of Monday, I had nothing. I just was like one of those squeaky dog toys is about all I could sound like. But I do have something here, so I might try to stay softer and rely on my microphone so I don't squeak too much. But more than enough to dive into Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Now, before we get into chapter 8, though, I know that we have some of our Awana workers back in here that we haven't seen for quite some time on a Wednesday night, so we're glad to have you all here. But we're also a pretty good ways through Ecclesiastes, so I thought it might be a good time to take just a few minutes to begin and to do it kind of a recap and to go back to the beginning and see how we got to where we are. As we read the Bible, often with sermons or even in our reading, personal reading, we're reading just a few verses at a time or a day, or you might, have a verse of the day or something like that, and you get these verses or you read a chapter, and we forget that when these were written, they were written as a whole sometimes. And so it's easy to kind of lose track of the greater context when we read just a few verses out of one of the epistles. We forget this was written as a letter. You sit down and read it as a letter. And so it's good sometimes to back up and to remind ourselves of the process or the flow, maybe, of how things were written and how we get to where we are. So we don't lose track of that context. And I've tried to do that, but just for a few minutes, let's think back here in Ecclesiastes and remember how we've arrived at chapter 8. So when we go back to the beginning of Ecclesiastes, we remember that we're looking at the works of Solomon here. He's presented himself as a teacher or a preacher and doesn't call himself by his name, but he's presented himself as this wise teacher who is toward the end of his life, and he's looking back on all that he's experienced, and he's sharing this wisdom. And so we look in chapter 1, verse 12, and what we find in verses 12 and 13, he says, I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I gave my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all the things that are done under heaven. This sore travail has God given the sons of man to be exercised therewith. Let's keep going. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. That which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered. So here he starts the book with this declaration that all that he sees, all that he has witnessed as he's watching as time goes by, as things come and things go, all he sees, he says, everything is vanity. Everything comes and then it passes and it moves on, and what was is barely even remembered as we move forward in time. And over and over we find the phrase that there is no profit in any of it. And so we have from his experience, his years of life, and all the things that he has seen and done, he says, based on his experience, there is no profit under the sun. That what you get, you use or you lose. If nothing else, by the end of your life, you die and you take nothing with you anyway. And so there is no profit in the end. You come into the world naked and you leave the world naked. You don't have anything beyond that. That's what he means when he says there's no profit in any of this. And so what's the point? If there's no profit, if you don't have anything to show for it when you're done, what's the point of all of this? And this is what he calls vanity or meaninglessness or emptiness, the Hebrew word being hevel. Hevel, just the picture there is of smoke, that there's just nothing that you can hold on to. You can see it, it's kind of there, but when you try to grab it, it's just gone. And so this is his picture of reality, of what he can see here under the sun based on his experience, is everything is just smoke. It just all disappears. And so he decides that he is going to see if he can discover more if he can find something of any value as he's watching things go by, is there anything that is of any real profit, anything you can hold on to that's more than just hevel, that's more than just emptiness and vanity? And so in chapter 2, he begins. He says in verse 1, I said in my heart, go to now, I will prove thee with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. And behold, this also was vanity. And so he starts off on these experiments, sort of. And based on his experience, he was going to try to find something of value. So sort of this was his applying the first test is this test of experience. What can he do? And he try all of these different things in all of these different realms, and there's no value. All of it is vanity over and over again. And so he does come away with one thing that does show some promise, some possible value, and that is wisdom. All through, we find him coming back to this idea of wisdom, that wisdom is better than folly. And so he keeps coming back to this. Look down in chapter 2, verse 12. He says, and I turn myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly. For what can a man do that cometh after a king, even that which has already been done? Then I saw that wisdom excelleth folly as far as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. I myself perceive that also that one event happens to them all. Then said I in my heart, as it happened to the fool, so it happens even to me. Why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart that this also is vanity. And so he thinks he's on the right track of trying to find something of real value, of lasting worth. He says wisdom is that thing. Wisdom seems to be the greatest thing that he can find in the world under the sun. Wisdom is that thing that holds the most promise. And he says there is value there. It far exceeds folly, as far more than light to darkness. That wisdom is so much greater. And yet at the end we read there, but even that, I perceive that the same thing that happens to the fool also happens to the wise man. In the end, they both die. And that's the end. And so there is still nothing of any great worth after that. And he continues to explore this idea of wisdom all through. It seems to be the second test that he applies to all of these things. He keeps coming back to it. He applies the test of experience. I do all of these things, and I watch all of these things, and in my experience, it's all hevel, it's all vanity. And so he applies his mind to it and his wisdom to it, and he thinks through and he philosophizes and he does all of this. And at the end, wisdom gets him no great understanding or nothing of any more value, because in the end, wisdom can only get you so far. Wisdom, too, is limited. As we'll find, wisdom can only go so far. And so then he moves from there to the last thing, from experience to wisdom, finally to theology, is where he ends up with. What more is there? So we find there let's look at chapter 3, verse 11. There are several places you could go, but chapter 3, verse 11, it says, he hath made, speaking of God, he hath made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has set the world in their heart, so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from beginning to end. I know that there is good in them, but for man to rejoice. There is no good in them, but for man to rejoice and to do good in his life. And also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. This is the gift of God. I know that whatsoever God does, it shall be forever, and nothing can be put to it, nor anything taken from it. And God does it that men should fear before him. So this is the final test, and finally, he's found something that has some profit, that has some value, that doesn't just come and then goes away. It's not just smoke, because what God does never changes. What God does lasts forever. And so finally he arrives at this point, and he does this over and over again, as we've seen, that he goes into these different areas to investigate. And that's really what we find in the end of chapter 3 and chapter 4, 5, and 6. What we find here is him exploring these different things. He explores injustice there at the end of chapter 3. Then he goes into exploring oppression and then loneliness and religion there in chapter 5. We looked at that one Sunday night. He explores religion. He goes into wealth. A lot of end of chapter 5 and chapter 6 is about wealth, because that was a big thing for him. He spends a lot of time talking about that one and exploring, because surely if there is anything that we can seek in this world that has value, it is wealth, it is gain, it is money and riches and all of that. And he, over and over again, he applies his tests. He experiences these things, and he watches the people who are diving into these different areas. And through his experience, he says, nope, there's nothing here. He applies his wisdom to it, and he just can't quite grasp what's going on here, the meaning behind all of this. And he's left with all of these questions, these goads that we keep coming back to, that he just can't find the answer to. And then finally, every time he comes back to his final test, his final chance to make it all make sense, and he comes back to God. Right? He comes back to theology every time, that God is the one behind all of this, that God's the one who is making this happen. God's the one who has the answers, and God's the only one who can provide any value to any of this that we're seeing. And he just finally keeps coming back to that. So that gets us to chapter 7. And in chapter 7, if you remember, we looked at those good and bad, and sometimes good and better, and we looked at those would you rather kind of questions. Would you rather have this or this? And applying wisdom, he tried to understand what was the best he could do in this world, and what would he seek, and how could he best thrive in this world. And what he came to at the end of that discussion, what I think is one of the greatest turning points here in Ecclesiastes, is Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 13 and 14, where he says, "Consider the work of God, for who can make straight that which he has made crooked?" And if you remember, when we started off way back here in chapter 1, when we looked at verse 12, or verse 15, he said, "That which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered." So he started with this realization that what is, that we take life as it comes. If we end up on a crooked road, we can't straighten it out. We just have to walk it the way that it is. If something is not right, we just have to suffer through it and move on with that. And what we finally arrive at here in chapter 7, what he has led us to all this way, is that yes, you're experiencing the good and the bad, but what we find in verse 13 is, "Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked?" That crooked path that you find yourself stuck on, God's the one who put you there. That you're there because he's the one who brought you there. Notice verse 14. "In the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider God also has set the one over against the other, to the end that man should find nothing after him." God gives us the day of prosperity and the day of adversity. That both of these things are experiences that God has given us. He's the one who gave us the crooked path, and he did it for a reason, for his own reason. He goes in, the end of chapter 7 is using his wisdom again. He keeps coming back to his own wisdom. I think this might be the folly of Solomon, is he touches on these greater theological truths that God is sovereign, God is the one in charge, but he always keeps coming back down to this lower realm of understanding, which is his own wisdom. I think this is the true folly of wise men in the world. While yes, it is better than the foolish men of the world who only live based on experience and based on what they see, it is a step up from that, but it can never get you the real answers, because our wisdom is limited by us. And that's how he ends chapter 7, as he looks around for wise men and wise women, and he says, I only found one wise man, and I didn't find a single wise woman in the whole, everywhere I see. And the wise man he was talking about was probably himself. And so that was, well, that's your opinion, Solomon. You should make better friends. I don't know. But whatever the case, that was what he had brought him now to chapter 8. And so, of course, of all things to go into, when we have arrived at this point, you'll never guess where he goes next. Politics. I don't know why, but in his mind it makes perfect sense, I guess. But that's where we come to here in chapter 8. And I think what it is this question of authority. I think that's what is on his mind. Remember, Solomon is a king, and he shares some thoughts here that he is considering exactly what it means to be king and what it means to have authority and have those who have authority over him. And so as he considers these things, that's what he is on his mind, because he goes from here in chapter 8 talking about authority and governance and politics to chapter 9 where he's talking about the sovereignty of God. And he elevates it once more. And so, but for now, we're in chapter 8. So that's how we have gotten here. So let's see what we can find here in chapter 8. Starting in verse 1, he's still kind of carrying over the thoughts of the wise man from the previous chapter. So in verse 1, we have, who is a wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? Man's wisdom maketh his face to shine, and the boldness of his face shall be changed. So he asks these rhetorical questions. Who's a wise man? Who knows the interpretation? He says that you'll know them when you see them. They stand out in a crowd, because a wise person is someone whose face seems to glow. That there's something about true wisdom that lessens the hardness, with the word boldness there. It's the hard features of your face. So when you're experiencing difficult times, a fool here, as he's saying, someone who doesn't have this wisdom, is someone who lets those experiences bring them down and harden their features and leave them looking like the Grinch or like Ebenezer Scrooge, right? But the wise man is the one who knows better, who doesn't let those things harden his features. He seems to shine. And so there we have, let's carry over of who is the wise man and who knows the interpretation of a thing. I can't read that without thinking the first person that comes to my mind is Daniel. Right? And someone who knows the interpretation of a thing. I immediately think of Daniel. He was the interpreter of dreams. And there he was in the halls of power. They're surrounded by people who were the most powerful men in the world. And yet we find him completely unflappable in all of those situations. When people were coming to literally to kill him because of the mistakes and the foolishness of someone else, they were coming to kill him. And he says, well, wait, let's talk this through. And he doesn't let it slow him down. And he prays to God and gets the answer to deliver himself and the other wise men in the courts. And so we see men like that who go through terrible, traumatic times and still seem to come out doing well and looking like they are comfortable and in charge because they are fully relying on God. And that is the wisdom that we find here. So verse 2, I counsel thee to keep the king's commandment, and that in regard to the oath of God, be not hasty to go out of his sight, and stand not in an evil thing, for he doeth whatsoever pleaseth him. Where the word of the king is, there is power. And who may say to him, what doest thou? Whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment, because to every purpose there is time and judgment. Therefore the misery of man is great upon him, for he knoweth not what shall be. For who can tell him when it shall be? There is no man that hath power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit, neither hath he power over the day of death. And there is no discharge in that war, neither shall wickedness deliver those who are given to it. Stop there for now. This first section, as he's talking about the authority of a king. In verse 2, he gives, now in my King James, it feels like it softens the blow in its translation. You'll notice the I counsel thee, the counsel thee are italicized, meaning they're kind of added in to smooth out the text, and it is choppy in Hebrew, so they added it for a reason. But the way we read that, I think it lessens the blow. This is an imperative. This is a command. He's not just, I would recommend that you obey the king. This is a command. He is saying, keep the king's commands. This is a direct command, an imperative. Keep the king's command. This is what we are told to do by Scripture, that we are to keep the king's commands. And he says that we do this in regard to the oath of God. This kind of references us back to chapter 5, where it talks about making vows and oaths, that if we make a vow, then we are bound, duty-bound to keep it, because not just because of our respect for the person who we make the oath to, but because of God. And we're better not making any oaths at all than to make one we're not going to keep. And that we have vowed, as citizens of whatever nation we're a citizen of, we have pledged our allegiance to that country. That's what we do when we say the pledge. We are pledging our allegiance to the flag and the nation for which it stands. That's what we're doing. Now, I do like that we throw in that little phrase, at least since the 50s, we add in that phrase, under God. That's, as long as we're under God, I'll keep right on saying that pledge. If we took that out, I might have second thoughts. But anyway, we pledge our allegiance to a nation. Now, we don't have a king. We have a president, and we can argue whether that's more or less anytime we want to, but we have a government that has been established by God. And that's one of the things that the Bible calls us to recognize in several different places. Probably the most prominent is in Romans chapter 13. Let's go ahead and read that, just because it ties in so nicely. So in Romans chapter 13, and I think this is important because in Solomon's writing, the king is Solomon, who is, at least supposedly, a very godly man. It is a godly government in a God-fearing kingdom. But in Romans, whenever Paul is writing Romans, the government that he is under is not a godly nation at all. It's far from it. They are very near to being severely persecuted for being Christians here in this context. And so it is far from it. And yet we find in Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 5, he says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. For there is no power but of God. The powers that are ordained by God. Whosoever therefore resists the power resists the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is a minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that does evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake." It's a very plain passage of Scripture, as much as people dislike it at times. It's a very plain passage of Scripture that we are to live in subject to governing authorities. It says that those authorities are there. The only way any government in this world exists is because God allows it. God puts it in place. And if you resist that, then you are fighting against the sovereignty of God itself. Right? That's what all of that relies on. Is if you believe that God is sovereign, then you believe that every government that exists or ever has existed was there because of the will of God, which is a difficult thing for us to wrap our minds around, because I don't know what wicked government your mind went to whenever we were talking about that, but thinking of whatever wicked ruler you popped up in your mind, and Romans 13 says that government is the minister of God. That ruler is the minister of God. He was put there to serve a purpose by God. That is hard to hold on to. And we'll get into more of it in Ecclesiastes, but that's what Romans says, that the governments are established for that reason, for a purpose, and that we are to live in submission to those authorities. That is how that is supposed to work. And so, with that in mind, coming back here to Ecclesiastes, back in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, we're told that because of our oath, because God has established these kingdoms, we are to follow along. Verse 3 says we're not to be hasty to go out of his sight and to stand not in an evil thing. So we aren't to hide from our duty in standing before the king or the government, not to hide from our duty or shirk our responsibilities. We're also not to stand against it in opposition and in rebellion, or not to take part in any kind of a coup. And that is not our place. That is not what we're supposed to be doing as those who have who are followers of God, who have sworn these oaths, we are respecting the authorities that God has put in place. Again, it says it very plainly here, and in Romans 13, in 1 Peter 2, I think we'll go there later, but all of it's laid out very plainly, not to set ourselves in opposition of those things. Verse 4, where the word of the king is, there is power. And who may say unto him, what doest thou? And so, there again, well, all of verses 3 and 4 and into 5, those coups and rebellions and revolutions and all, those things really very rarely end well for anyone involved. There is a reason that the power rests with the king, with the governing authorities, that they are the ones who are in power, and setting yourself against that is setting yourself up for a hard time, because those things are firmly fixed in place. They are the ones with the power, and we have not experienced the kind of monarchy that is talked about here, where really the king could, off with his head, and what he said went, is what they were under right here. And so we might not have personal experience with that, but that's what Solomon is talking about. And to an extent, we still see that. It certainly still exists in other places around the world. And so he's talking about even those kind of situations. Our role is to respect the governing authorities and to obey the commands of the government as they are sent down. So, now, what about, he goes on, what about when the things that they say aren't things we want to hear? What about those things that, how does it say it in verse 6? When the misery of man is great upon him. This is when the burden is heavy, when it is a weighty matter. These are things that we don't like. Still, we are told even in those situations, and what it says in verses 5 and 6, it says that there is a wise man's heart, at the end of verse 5, a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment, because to every purpose there is time and judgment. There is time and judgment. In all of these purposes, in all of these situations, what a wise man is to consider is time and judgment. Now, time is pretty simple. Think about the timing of things. Not everything has to be about right now. Consider timing and not be hasty. The judgment there, you can look at different translations, and people don't really know what to do with that word. The word really is, it's mishpat. It's judgment. It's how it's translated everywhere else. But what's it talking about here? And I think what it's talking about by way of judgment is the judgment of the person who is getting involved. It's discernment might be another word that we would use here. How are you judging what's going on? Using discernment whenever considering these weighty things. Whenever we look at things in our day and age, the things in our government that we don't like, that are these heavier matters, whatever it is, there are plenty of those things right now. These battles that are being fought over weighty issues, whether abortion or homosexual rights, over all of these things that are going on that we look at, and these are the battles that we're fighting. We are to consider these things and consider our time and our judgment. We're to consider with discernment. We're not to rush in and storm the Capitol. We're not to just grab our guns and start an open rebellion. We are called to obey the governing authorities. Now, thankfully, we live in a country where we do have means of letting our voice be heard, of resisting things we disagree with, of showing our concern, of putting people into power who agree with how we think about these things. And we have a duty, just like it talked about there in the beginning, we have a duty to do those things. We should not be shirking those responsibilities by hiding out or running away. We have a duty to do that and to step up when we need to step up. But that is to be done under the course of the law. It is to be done legally. It's to be done in accordance with our oath that we have sworn to be good citizens. So that is all part of that. So that brings us down to verse 7. Yeah, we're doing great. That brings us down to verses 7, where Solomon, I think he kind of, all through Ecclesiastes, I think just on his mind through this whole book is the concept of death. Because it really does. It just kind of creeps in all through the book. He makes a tie-in to death, the end of life, to mortality. And here it finds its way into this discussion where he says, for who knows what shall be or when it shall be, that we don't know how things are going to work out. We don't have all the answers. That's why we're to use our discernment in judging the timing of things and to not be hasty. Because in verse 8, he says, for there is no man that has the power to over the Spirit or to retain the Spirit, neither does he have power over the day of death. As for all we know, death could be just around the corner. And then all of these arguments, all of the bickering, all of the politics, all of these weighty matters don't mean anything anymore. Because just around the corner, for every one of us, is the day of our death. Right? It's right there. It's closer for some of us than for others, but we don't even know who that is. I mean, we might try to judge based on how much gray hair or something along that line, but we have no way to judge when that day will be. And so we step back and keep things in perspective whenever we're looking at these things that are going on, because all of this really is still hevel. It's still vanity. All of this are things that have no profit. All of these are things that only matter now. And we're to be considering things that have true profit, things that are going to mean something even on into eternity. And whatever politics, whatever vote, whatever race, whatever is going on now in government only matters now. It won't even matter here in this world in a few decades. All of that will be water under the bridge. It'll be hevel. It'll be smoke that is gone. And so we need to keep in perspective that what we are to consider are things that are eternal, things of true profit. And so he says, remember that we don't know the day of our death. And he says there is no discharge in that war. None of us get out of that. The war with our own mortality. None of us can escape that. And there is no dictator so wicked, no despot so powerful that he can escape from the day of his death. You cannot be wicked or evil enough to fight that battle. We all die, and we all reach that same end. And so that's where he leaves that. But now he does ask the next question moving forward in verse 9. And that is, what about governments that have gone wrong? Those wicked, unjust governments. And that's what he moves into. He says, all this have I seen and applied my heart unto every work that is done under the sun. There is a time wherein one man rules over another to his own hurt. And so I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of the holy, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This also is vanity. Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Though a sinner do evil 100 times, and his days be prolonged, yet surely I know that it shall be well with them that fear God, which fears before him. But it shall not be well with the wicked, neither shall he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he feareth not before God. There is a vanity which is done upon the earth, that there be just men, unto whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. And again, there be wicked men, to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I said that this also is vanity. So what about those governments that are corrupt? What about those who are doing the things that we would resist, that we see and would rebel against? He says in verse 9 that sometimes there are governments or rulers that work to their own detriment, to their own hurt. The things that they do, you look at and you say, that is the dumbest thing they could do. It's just, you're shooting yourself in the foot doing all of these things. Why would you possibly do that? And we see it in our country. We see it in other countries. We see it throughout history. These men or governments that get in power and the things that they do, we can see from a mile away, we can see that they're just driving themselves into a ditch. what do we do about those things when we see that sometimes these governments, possibly the one we're in, is working to its own detriment? In verse 9, we see that sometimes the wicked are celebrated and the righteous are neglected. That's what it's talking about there in verse 10. When I saw the wicked buried, remember that a burial was something that was a mark of honor for them. And so think of watching a funeral procession of someone who was just a wicked, vile person, and yet in their death, they're being celebrated as if they were a grand hero, as if this was the greatest man to live in our day, and we're celebrating that person, even though everyone knows that this was a wicked, wicked man, and yet we're celebrating that person. And while we're celebrating this person, the truly righteous people, the helpful people, the men and women of the city are being neglected and forgotten. What do we do when we see that? And we see that. That happens. I won't name names, but we see that going on. In our day and time, we see wicked men being celebrated, and those and true people of true value, of righteousness, people who are living good lives and helping people, they're just completely forgotten, and their name never makes it out there. And so what do we do when we see this happening? What about verse 11? Sometimes we see just a blatant miscarriage of justice. Right? What do we see when we look and that the sentence against an evil work is not executed? Therefore, the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Whenever justice isn't done, wicked men will just feel more free to do more wicked things. Evil abounds when good men do nothing. When there's no justice, there's no reason for them to stop. So what do we do when we look in the world and we see vile people doing wicked things and yet not being punished for it? And so it just gets worse. Things just escalate because there is no justice. So what do we do when we see this going on? In verse 12, he says, though a sinner do evil 100 times and his day is prolonged, his answer is, surely I know that it will be well with them that fear God, which fear before him. So this is Solomon's answer, is that yes, sometimes we see justice miscarried, we see wickedness prevailing in our culture, we see it being celebrated, but again, the battle with death is not one that anyone can escape. Eventually, all will face the true judgment, that everyone will stand before a righteous God and give an account, and that even though they may escape justice in this life, the moment they step outside of it, they'll feel what real justice is, and they'll answer for those things. Now, it is easy for us to feel a little bit of righteous vindication when thinking of that, but just remember what our condition would be if we were standing before that same judge on our own merit. Before we get too eager to condemn others, even those most wicked of people that we see out there, just remember that if we stood before the same judge, we would be equally guilty. We would be just as fallen, just as sinful. All that we have between us and the same fate is the grace of God and the blood of Jesus. That's it. So remember that when thinking of those and for praying for those imprecatory prayers for God to call down judgment on our enemies. Just consider there's a place for that, but let's not lose touch with who we are as well, but for the grace of God. So that's his answer. Now from there he goes on, he says that sometimes we see that in verse 14, we see wicked men who receive the rewards of the righteous and righteous men who receive the judgment of the wicked. And again, we don't have to think hard to find examples. It's better if I stick with biblical examples. If you think of Naboth, is one of the ones that come to mind. Naboth, who had the vineyard right next to Ahab's palace. And just one trumped up charge by Jezebel, and Naboth was killed because he wouldn't hand over his family land that he had every right to be on. He was executed so that Ahab could claim the land, and he didn't keep whining in his bed. His wife came and fixed it for him. And so we see that sort of justice being carried, so-called justice being carried out, where the wicked receive the reward that rightfully belonged to the righteous. We see it happening. The greatest example of that, we don't have to think too hard to find. Who is the greatest example of this kind of failure in justice? Jesus. He's the one man who truly was innocent, who deserved no justice, no punishment, had no sin at all to his name, to his record, and yet he received the greatest judgment experienced by anyone throughout history. All the sin of all of mankind. I'm not just talking about the cross. All the sin of mankind and the wrath of God for that sin was placed on him. Other people were executed by crucifixion. No one else experienced that. And yet it was placed on a perfectly innocent man. And so, again, let's step back and consider whenever we start crying foul. When we start crying injustice, and that's not fair. That is the nature of a sin, sick, and fallen world. It's not fair. It is unjust. But there's more to come. Right? And so because of that, because we see that, and we're not going to end on that dour note, because when we keep reading, the next thing that Solomon has to say, what is the response to that? Whenever we see that kind of injustice, how do we respond to that? Well, Solomon's answer, then I commended mirth. In verse 15, what? Well, I recommend happiness. We should throw a party. I commended mirth, because a man has no better thing under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry. For that shall abide with him of the days of his labor, the days of his life, which God gives him under the sun. So what's the response to injustice in the world? Go out and enjoy your day. Have a good meal. Enjoy time with friends and family. Celebrate the blessings that God has given you. That's the response. And it's the same response that we've seen all through the book. He keeps coming back to this. Eat and drink and be merry. This is the response. Because we can celebrate even in the face of complete injustice, even in the face of persecution, in the face of all of these things that we've read about, we can celebrate. Because we know that what we have is the only thing of real profit. It's the only thing that means anything. If we didn't have a hope for the future, then we would have no reason to celebrate. But because we can go through any of these situations knowing that God is working for us and that what God does is permanent, it has no end, it goes on into eternity, then we can enjoy whatever little thing we find to celebrate. It doesn't have to be much. We can celebrate anything. As we saw in the beginning of the chapter, a wise man his face can be bright in whatever situation. Whether you're celebrating a good day's work, in the close of the day with your family, you're celebrating a beautiful day in God's creation, you're celebrating just the goodness of God. Whatever it is you find to celebrate, a righteous man, a godly man, can always celebrate. We can always find joy because our joy is not based on who wins what election. Because we know that whatever the case, God's in charge. God's the one who made it all happen. And we may be completely beyond ourselves to understand why. I don't get it, God, but you're in charge. So here we go. And we can celebrate even that. There is no reason, absolutely no reason why after who knows what happening in the month of November, why any Christian should be disappointed, should be upset, should be angry. Because whatever happened, you know who made it happen? God. And we might have opinions one way or the other of how things would be better for us on the other side of it. But if it works out that way, it did so by the will of God. And so we have no reason to think, well, we lost that one. No, we didn't. God won. We don't understand what he was fighting. We don't know what prize he was going for, maybe. But God wins every election. Okay? And so we have to keep that in mind. And if that is confusing to you, you're not alone. Right? Because here in Solomon ends the chapter, verses 16 and 17. In fact, I wanted to read this out of a different translation because it's a little confusing, and I found one that I thought said it very well, much more simply for me, I think. So, but it says, verses 16 and 17, again, these are the words of Solomon. It says, "For I have set my mind to learn wisdom and to observe the business that goes on in the world, even to the extent of going without sleep day and night. And I have observed all that God brings to pass. Indeed, man cannot guess the events that occur under the sun. For man tries strenuously, but fails to guess them. Even if a sage should think to discover them, he would not be able to guess them." No, it doesn't matter how smart you are, how wise you are, how much time you devote to reading the paper or listening to every reporter and watching the news. It doesn't matter. You're not going to be able to guess what God is doing behind the scenes. I mean, we can watch and we can observe and we can praise God for what he does, but we're not going to have all the answers. We're not going to figure it out. God's the one who's working. The best thing that we can do is to celebrate with what God has given us, to enjoy every day that we have, every blessing that we have, and rely on that. And you know where Solomon goes next, in the very next verse of the next chapter? "For all this I considered in my heart, even to declare all this, that the righteous and the wise and their works are in the hand of God." That's what he comes to. He says, I spent days and days, I went without sleep all this time to try to figure out what God is doing, and here's the best thing I could come up with. God's in charge. That's what he's got to offer. And I think it's a great place for us to end up. As we see what's going on, we can figure it out all we want. I'll be following elections and everything just like everyone else. But God's in charge. He's not going to lose. Whatever happens, whether we understand it or not, God's in charge. And so we can get up the next day, we can go the next week, and we can be just as happy and content and full of faith as we were before. Because where understanding ends, where our knowledge ends, we're not stuck. You see, for people here under the sun, the extent of our knowledge and intellect and understanding is as far as we can get, and anything beyond that is just void. But for us, there's something beyond that. We call it faith. Our intelligence only gets us so far. Our understanding, our science, our wisdom only gets us so far. Beyond that is faith. And we trust God with all the rest. Sometimes we have to go back and correct the things that we were trusting ourselves for. But we have God to rely on. Faith and understanding, and they aren't in contest. God helps us to understand a lot of things, but there will always be things that are beyond that we accept on faith because we can trust God and we rely on him. Would you stand with me? Anything that you'd like to add, any comment or remarks? All right, if not, let's go to the Lord in prayer one more time and be dismissed. Father, thank you again. God, we thank you. Never can thank you enough for all that you are in our lives and in the world around us. God, we trust in you. We let go of our worry. We let go of our fear, knowing that all of this is in your hands. And so, God, help us to just respond with joy, with your joy, with gratitude and thankfulness. Because everything that we face, everything that comes before us in our life, we know that you are the one who put us there. Whether the path is straight or crooked, you brought us here. You brought it for us here for your glory and for our good, and that you are going to love us and guide us every step of the way. So God, we thank you, and we trust you in faith, knowing that your will be done in our lives and in the world around us. Thank you, God. Amen.